Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo podcast. March 1836, after the battle. The Alamo has fallen, its defenders all dead. Just a few survivors remain to share the story. And as the news slowly spreads, the Texas Revolution carries on. Today we reveal the panic that ensued as ordinary citizens heard what happened at the Alamo, the devastating loss Texas suffered in Goliad, and why the front lines of battle moved eastward. I'm your host, Emily Baucom. Joining us today is the Alamo's researcher, Thomas Ledesma. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, I'm glad to be here, Emily. Thank you for having me.
What is happening at and around the Alamo in the days after the battle?
Directly after the battle, of course, the Mexican Army, the Army of Operations, is going to begin to clean up the carnage on the battlefield. Yet, it's not going to be the soldados themselves that are doing that work. Santa Anna's going to have the local alcalde or mayor called out, as well as the townsfolk that have remained in Behar to come and police up the battlefield. So they're stripping bodies of clothing, they're burying their own dead, they are separating that out of the defenders after some of the bodies have been identified by Joe and the mayor, and then they're going ahead and separating the weapons out, destroying them, possibly giving them away as loot to pay some of the officers and maybe some of the enlisted men. And then they're going to go ahead and bury the bodies of the soldados in the Campo Santo, which is about where Milam Park is today in downtown San Antonio. They run out of space, and so they begin to deposit the bodies in the San Antonio River. And the bodies of the Alamo defenders are taken to the banks of the San Antonio River and burned in funeral pyres.
The very next day after the battle, on March 7th, Santa Anna writes a message from his headquarters in San Antonio, and it's a bit of a victory lap.
Yes, so he's going to be writing letters out to the people that are still loyal to the government in Texas, telling them they have nothing to fear from the Mexican Army. And one of the other letters he's going to dispatch is back to Mexico City. And he's telling Tornell, one of the ministers in Mexico of war, telling him that he's had this great victory, that honor's been reimposed on Mexican arms after taking Behar back in the Alamo. And enclosed in this letter is the New Orleans Grays flag. And that is a big turning point for the conflict overall, something as minuscule as a flag. It shows that support, unofficial support, if you will, is coming from the United States by the form of these volunteers. And now this fight is taking on a new role. We see in the Battle of Behar previously, there's talk about supporting the Constitution of 1824 and all of these matters. And now you're seeing foreign individuals getting involved on a larger scale. So Santa Anna is able to politicize that and say this is a ploy by the United States to get involved in an internal conflict in Mexico. And of course, the Tornell Decree has been written saying that anybody under arms, any foreigner under arms in Mexico is deemed essentially a pirate. And that'll play a role later on.
On March 10th, 4 days after the battle, something interesting appears in the diary of William Fairfax Gray of Washington on the Brazos, showing the rest of Texas is completely in the dark about the fate of the Alamo.
Yes, so William Fairfax Gray is going to be a recent-ish arrival into Texas by that time. Native of Virginia, he comes into Texas kind of wanting to get in on the land speculation that's happening here as a lawyer by trade. He ends up in Washington on the Brazos and decides he wants to be involved in the political happenings of the town and in the convention that's occurring. Hoping to get a spot as a secretary, he gets passed up for that, but he keeps his own personal diary during that time. And it's very detailed and it's a wealth of information. And as you mentioned, in that diary, he's saying that no letters have come in from Travis in recent times. Now, in early February, and of course leading up to the famous Travis letter of the 24th, the convention and the people meeting there have been split on what to do. They know that Travis is in trouble. There's all kinds of different opinions on what this information means. At one point, you have people speculating that it's these letters coming from Behar and Goliad about the Mexican army moving up are to rally support for those men's independent causes, Travis and Fannin. Others say that the Mexican army wouldn't have got up there that fast. It's not a serious threat. Others think we need to go ahead and disintegrate the convention and march to their aid. And so you have all these conflicting reports, and then all of a sudden it goes silent.
Gray writes in his diary, "No news yet from the Alamo, and much anxiety is felt for the fate of the brave men there. It is obvious they must be surrounded, and all communications with them cut off."
People are thinking about what could be happening to the men at the Alamo, and that's pretty much from Behar to the east, everybody's still in the dark.
We see evidence, too, that in Goliad, news of the Alamo was slow to come.
Of course, there's been communication between Travis and Fannin about reinforcements. Of course, you have the story of Bonham writing out to Goliad, taking some of these letters and bringing responses back to the Alamo. And yet Fannin attempts to relieve the siege at the Alamo, has logistical problems, wagons breaking down, decides to fall back into Fort Defiance or Goliad and await further orders. And just like further east, the men down south are also in the dark about what's happening.
But then on March 12th, we believe Susanna Dickinson was finally able to share the grim story of what happened.
Yes, so if we take it back a few days to the convention time, of course we have an early March 2nd, Declaration of Independence for Texas is created. By March 4th, Sam Houston is finally granted control and command over all armed forces in Texas. So not just the regular Texas Army, but also any militia and volunteers that have been mustered. And that had been an issue prior to this point. One of the reasons why Houston leaves and goes to speak with the Cherokees because he's not given command of the forces. Once he gets command, people are still concerned about the Alamo. There's talk about leaving the Alamo, and he's saying, no, we have to stay here and create a government that's worth all this fighting. I will go ahead and group up with men and lift the siege at the Alamo. So he leaves and goes to Gonzales. We think, like you mentioned, that Susanna Dickinson around the 12th arrives in Gonzales, but a few days before that, 2 rancheros from the Bear area show up in Gonzales with information that the Alamo has fallen. Houston, fearing that this news will spread throughout the forces that he has marshaled there, decides to separate those 2 out, basically accuses them of being spies possibly, and locks them away. He does write letters to Fannin and other people back in Washington on the Brazos that he believes that this information may have faulty details to it, but overall that it's probably accurate. And this is when he begins to issue orders to Fannin that he needs to group his soldiers up and possibly withdraw. What happens when Susanna Dickinson shows up is her and Almaron had lived in Gonzales. There's no possible way that you can sequester her out of the area. People are going to know her. People are looking for her. They've just written letters about how she was captive of the Mexican officers and they were concerned about her safety and what was going to happen next. And now that she's arrived in town along with Joe and another slave named Ben, there's no control over the information now. She certifies that the Alamo has fallen. Both Joe and Susanna will give information out that will form the narrative that we know today.
We see another entry from the diary of William Fairfax Gray on March 13th at Washington on the Brazos. He writes, "No intelligence yet from the Alamo. The anxiety begins to be intense." So confusion abounds.
It takes a long time for information to travel. In today's modern age, we're so used to the text message and the email. There's no Twitter. There's one printing press in Texas at the time. It takes days to get from point A to point B. And it also depends on how fast you decide to move. There's actually an issue that William Fairfax Gray mentions in his diary about news spreading throughout the East and the colonies is the government doesn't even have the money to pay for expresses to be sent out. And if a writer is going to get paid, they're going to have to take the money out of their own pockets because there are no government coffers to do that quite yet. And eventually, at the end of that day, into the next few days, the word about the fall of the Alamo reaches them.
But the revolution in the meantime moves on. A week after the Battle of the Alamo, the Battle of Refugio begins.
So mentioned a little bit earlier that Sam Houston assumes control of the army. When he hears about the fall of the Alamo, he had written that letter to Fannin, and his strategy is to move Fannin back from Goliad to Refugio. Now, if you look at a map, you see the Alamo and you see Goliad on the same bank of the San Antonio River, essentially. And a lot of military historians will call that the San Antonio-Goliad line. It's kind of a line of defense that they're using as their main strategy. With the Alamo gone, Goliad's open to a flanking maneuver. And of course, Goliad is a vital connection to the Gulf of Mexico. And Fannin is hoping to get some support possibly from the Texian Navy, but that hasn't happened quite yet. What he has to do is send out men to marshal the logistical needs. You can't just get in a truck and load up your stuff. You have to find draft animals, horses, and also the families that have been supportive of the garrison at Goliad or of the struggle overall on the Texian side need to be protected. Orders that Fannin receives from Houston say to go to San Patricio and Refugio, gather up what you can, help the people evacuate further east. So he dispatches a couple hundred men to do that. The men seem to get distracted. They're going to go out and punitively punish the locals in the area that have been supportive of the government of Mexico or have kind of been neutral towards this Texian cause. And they get caught up in those efforts that General Urrea is able to catch them. And eventually Urrea will capture several hundred men or disperse them. Some are captured, some are killed, some will make it back to Goliad with the news. But overall, that is a disaster, and it wastes crucial time for the men at Goliad.
This series of skirmishes from March 13th to 15th, and on March 15th, news of the Alamo finally reaches the convention at Washington on the Brazos.
There we see William Fairfax Gray talking about, again, the news and how it affects how people are feeling at the convention, what to do next. Finally, at this point, you have some semblance of a government that's sort of unified, if you will, which is a tough thing that isn't really the case throughout most of the early revolution. Some men are trying to muster recruits to join the army. Some are trying to figure out what is next for themselves and their families. And you have the beginning of what becomes the runaway scrape.
And what is the runaway scrape?
It really starts off, you can think about it from anybody that's living around Behar and the Mexican army approaches, anybody that's been loyal to the Texian government slowly begins to move east. They don't want to be confronted by the Mexican government and lose any of their valuables or whatnot and their lives. So they're moving away. You get to Gonzales on March 11th or 12th. Susanna Dickinson's tale gets out. People begin to get nervous in Gonzales. Gonzales has already been hit a heavy blow. There's 20-odd families that have lost a loved one in this Battle of the Alamo. It's devastating for that community. Pretty much everybody in that town, they know it's a small knit community, so that loss is very deep, and people begin to fear for their safety. So they begin to move east. That movement of people will catch up to Washington on the Brazos. The news arrives, and then so people in Washington and other colonist towns in the east begin to pack up their belongings and move east to try to outrun the Mexican army.
We have an artifact from the runaway scrape on display right now in the Alamo exhibit at the Ralston Family Collection Center. It's a cast iron pot.
Yeah, so we look at items like cast iron pot and the trivet that it sits on, a family Bible that we have on display, and we look at these items, and it's the bare bones things that people took with them. They understand that whatever they leave behind may be procured by the Mexican army or even the Texian forces. You're saddling up and taking your livestock with you if you can, if the army hasn't requested their use of it. And so you're taking the bare minimum things to cook for your family, to protect your family, maybe a chair here or there if you're lucky, if you have a wagon that can transport that, because if you don't have a wagon or a draft animal, you're carrying everything you can. It's a pretty horrific experience for the people that are in the runaway scrape. They're not prepared. They truly think the Mexican army is closer than they probably are in most cases, but fear overtakes them. They're trying to get to safety. You know, women and children barefoot in the mud, trying to cross rivers. We have a story of a gentleman trying to ford a river, the Brazos, I believe, and his horse begins to act up. He tries to retrieve his horse and ends up getting attacked by a very large alligator. So there's a lot of trials and tribulations on that trail.
In mid-March, William Fairfax Gray describes the desperate atmosphere of the runaway scrape. He writes in his diary, "The Alamo has now fallen, and the fate of the country is becoming every day more and more gloomy."
And I would say that's desperation and fear of what's next is definitely sweeping the land at that point.
But also in mid-March, Sam Houston, he's writing to the chairman of the military committee about everything Susanna Dickinson told him, and he's working on making plans for the future.
So Sam Houston, again, he's at Gonzales. The person that really brings a lot of the men together at Gonzales is a character that we've talked about before. We have Colonel Neal. He leaves the Alamo, leaving Travis in command to go look after his family. And there's also reports of some materials that may have been gathered for the garrison at Behar, and he wants to go ahead and see about those as well. He knows he can't break the siege himself at the Alamo, so he goes ahead and calls for volunteers to muster at Gonzales. Houston shows up. Those soldiers are therefore transferred under Houston's command. And now he has to think about what's going to happen next. We mentioned that he orders Fannin to fall back. He hasn't heard any news from Fannin either, so he's growing concerned about that. But he also knows that he has to move his army to the east as well. If the Alamo is gone and orders are being sent to Fannin for him to fall back, then that defensive line also has to fall back. There's a lot of speculation at that time about what Sam Houston's strategy is. He's keeping a very small council, pretty much just to himself. What happens is he orders the army to take up a general line of retreat.
He writes, "By falling back, Texas can rally and defeat any force that can come up against her."
Yes, so he's writing that and dispersing that sort of information out to the troops. But if we look at it from documents that he writes later on, we see that there's another strategy that he's holding on to. If we look to the east, from Gonzales to the border of Louisiana is almost an open gate. You can move your men quickly through there if you need to, and the local population out to east. And why would you want to go east? Well, you have a buffer zone there with the United States. It's no secret that Andrew Jackson and Sam Houston have a very close relationship. Sam Houston looks towards Jackson as a mentor and friend, and there's all this speculation about the United States getting actually involved. So not volunteers from Louisiana or Alabama or Georgia, but the U.S. Army and military getting involved. And so there was speculation, and later on proved that Houston's strategy in the beginning was to fall back, hopefully under the protection of the United States at some point.
He has that hope, but right now in mid-March, he is outnumbered. He writes his camp has just 374 men with less than 2 days' worth of food. Many don't have weapons or ammo. Meantime, he shares intelligence that Santa Anna has about 2,000 troops heading to Gonzales.
Marshaling up your forces, you're undermanned and undersupplied. They're going to go ahead and leave Gonzales. It's lit aflame and destroy anything that you can't take with you so the enemy can't make use of it. And the other hope about moving east is you're moving towards the colonies. There's a big issue within the Texian forces at the time. A lot of the men that have been fighting in these battles happen to be adventurers that have recently arrived from the United States, and we see the New Orleans Grays here at the Alamo and other folks like that. There is some contention in letters written back home about the native, if you will, Texians that are here that have been living here. These colonists haven't taken up arms yet on a mass level. Well, with the fall of the Alamo and now the retreat from Goliad hopefully underway, Houston's probably also hoping to rally up those colonists that have been there for a while to finally take up arms.
On March 18th, there is great concern of an attack in Goliad.
We had Fannin dispatch men to gather up those supplies in Refugio. Those men are captured or slain or dispersed. And finally, Fannin gets orders to retreat to Victoria. He reads those orders from Houston, packs up his belongings, begins to move out. At certain times, it's very lackadaisical. Some of his officers write later on that they were questioning his motives, why he was moving so slow. But eventually he's able to gather up enough of his forces, realizes that the men he's dispatched are not coming back. Maybe if there's any survivors from an attack, they'll regroup with them later on, but it's time to move out of Goliad.
The next day, Fannin and his men begin their retreat, and by the end of the day, they'll have fought in the Battle of Coleto Creek.
Logistics has always been a problem for Fannin and the men at Goliad. They try to relieve the Alamo, carts begin to break down, they are within maybe 200 yards of leaving Fort Defiance, and they turn around and go back in. During the Battle of Coleto Creek, they've abandoned their heavy iron guns that they can't take with them, disabled several things, burned any material munitions they can't use, and with heavy laden ox carts begin to move out. Now, something that people might not think about are the draft animals themselves, and much of the record we have say that the animals are in pretty deplorable condition. Men aren't really paying attention to them. They're focused on getting supplies and goods rallied up, looking after their own selves, things that would typically happen in a hectic situation like this. Eventually, the logistics begin to break down. They're out in an open field, and there's a tree line several miles away, within close enough proximity, and Fannin orders his men to stand down. And they're going to take a break in this open field. And the officers begin to question him and ask, why would we stop here and not in a covered place where we could use our numbers to put a superior fire on the enemy and have a defensible area instead of being in an open field? And Fannin's reported to have some confidence in saying that there's no way that the Mexican army is going to attack such a large force in the open. And so he tells his men to go ahead and settle in. The Mexican cavalry shows up. Dispatched force of Texian cavalry alerts the infantry to this, and the slow-moving caravan that's in the open ends up setting up for an infantry square, which they put their cannons, their light artillery on each corner of the square, Fannin and the officers in the middle, with the infantry forming the walls along with other carts and wagons that they've piled up to make makeshift walls. They're fighting off the Mexican cavalry, and an infantry square is great at that. That's what its purpose is. But it's basically buying time for General Urrea. The cavalry disperses. There's an infantry attack. They're basically just pinning in Fannin's men until the artillery rolls up. Once the artillery arrives, Urrea is able to lob shell and shot into the infantry square, and it becomes a massacre. Finally, terms of surrender will come up, and there's a lot of controversy in these terms of surrender. Fannin and his officers draft a document to present to General Urrea with articles asking that lives will be spared, personal property of officers will be respected, and so on and so forth. And General Urrea comments that the only surrender that we're able to accept is at the discretion of the government. So you surrender at discretion, and the governmental authorities will choose what happens to you next. Somewhere from that conversation of these officers to the men under Fannin's command gets distorted. men believe that they're going to be treated as prisoners of war, so there's going to be legal protection over them and the possibility of being brought back to the United States. Looking at Urrea's account after the war is over, he writes that he had never promised anything except that he would intercede on their behalf as much as he could to Santa Anna.
Santa Anna, though, still orders executions.
Correct. So at the Battle of Refugio, and there's skirmishes at San Patricio, and all throughout the Gulf Coast region down south, Texians are captured. And General Urrea is trying to find a way around these orders of execution. He says, well, there are men that are caught under arms here. What can I do? Well, one, there's some doctors here. The Mexican army is in severe need of physicians. So anybody who's a physician or has medical training, step off to the side. And he sequesters those people out. He finds that there are a big group of people that just arrived from New York. They don't have any arms with them. They've come as volunteers, but not supplied. So technically, they haven't fought against the Mexican government. And so we're going to use those men to rebuild the fort at Goliad. He's also going to look for anybody that has any kinds of trade skill, mechanics, carpenters, so on and so forth, and helps set those people aside too, as saying that they're really needed for the Mexican army so that the soldiers don't have to do that work. But still, even with putting those men aside, there's roughly 300-something men that are still prisoners that are going to have to be dealt with. And Urrea issues orders to his second-in-command, Colonel Portilla, to take care of these men as best as you can, treat them respectfully, and await further orders. And as you mentioned, Santa Anna gets reports of this victory at Goliad and issues orders to Portilla and Urrea saying, you know the law, execute these men. And we have the letters from Portilla, and it mentions how he is torn as an individual. He says, I thought we were here to fight with honor and so on and so forth, but now you're asking me to execute these prisoners. And he's really stuck on what to do next. Urrea sends orders to him saying, just hold tight and we'll figure this out. But Santa Anna reissues a letter directly to Portilla saying, you're going to do this. And Portilla writes in his letters to Urrea that when I received commands from the general, I'm going to go ahead and have to follow those orders.
Those executions do take place on March 27th in what we now call the Goliad Massacre.
Yes, so it's a horrific event. The doctors that are taken out and some of the craftsmen are off in separate areas, and they begin to see these 3 columns move out from the fort, and they're listening to their comrades singing. Some of them are joyful, thinking, hey, we're headed to the coast to go ahead and go back to the United States. We're being paroled. Well, the details and organization of the Mexican army at this point is a little off. Timing is a little off. And from the survivors that we get from the massacre, they're point-blank distance. The soldados are to the prisoners, and these 3 different columns begin shooting at them at 3 separate times. And so men that are in these rear columns understand what's happening. Some try to flee, some fake dead, some are wounded and are on our save later on. And we have folks jumping into the San Antonio River and swimming away. So we do have some survivors from the massacre.
About 342 men were killed, but 28 men escaped. And that credit goes to a woman now known as the Angel of Goliad.
Francita Alves, she goes out and helps some of the folks there that are wounded. And other townspeople in the area would lend a hand, some taking prisoners and essentially hiding them, others just getting them squared away so they can move further east. But those accounts are pretty harrowing when you read what happened to the men that day.
This whole month, Santa Anna has still been in San Antonio, but on March 29th, he, like Sam Houston, ready to move on and move east.
Yes, so Santa Anna begins to marshal his forces, he organizes them, and has them moving east. Now, left behind in San Antonio are about 1,000 or so Mexican soldados. One of the things that to think about are the Mexican soldiers that have fought in the battle itself. So you have 1,000 men left here. Some are rebuilding the fort. San Antonio is going to serve as a base of operations for the Army of Operations. It's an overland logistics hub for them to utilize if they so desire. But what about the men that are casualties of the battle? Well, I mentioned earlier that some are the ones that have been killed are buried or disposed of in the San Antonio River. But what about the survivors? One thing that the Mexican army doesn't have is a dedicated medical corps. Some of the officers may have personal physicians, but for the enlisted men, there is no medical help per se, except any prisoners. Now, Urrea will eventually send doctors to the Alamo to help take care of Mexican soldiers, but in the direct aftermath of the Battle of the Alamo, there's nobody here. The physicians and anybody with medical knowledge that had been inside the fortress had been killed. We look at the diary of Enrique de la Peña, and he writes that finally Santa Anna is convinced that a field hospital must be created. And they go ahead and create this hospital, but there's really nobody there to help administer the medicines. And he writes that a lot of the men that were wounded could have been saved by the science of their times. And it's horrific. When those doctors from Goliad finally arrive, they say that these soldados are too far gone. Bullets hadn't been extracted, infections had set in, amputations were not done in a timely manner. And so even though the Mexican army is victorious on March 6, 1836, for the 450 to 600 or so casualties, the ones of that survived with wounds, it's another just harrowing event for them. And those men will be left behind. And Santa Anna's reportedly saying, whatever is their destiny is their destiny. We don't have time to stay here, and we don't have the supplies to look after them. So hopefully we can get some medical professionals from below the Rio Grande to come up here in time. And if not, so be it.
You mentioned that some of the soldados have stayed behind at the Alamo to make repairs. What are they repairing?
Any of the battle damage that had happened. So they may be filling. We know that Travis orders the men to dig rifle pits in the Long Barrack building, the old convento. So the Mexican soldados are possibly filling in those holes. They are repairing any battle damage to the walls and the structures that may have been happening from their artillery fire. It's quite possible that some of the buildings caught on fire during the siege and battle. So going in and repairing roofs and different things like that. They're just going throughout and cleaning up the battlefield in that sense.
Thomas Ledesma, thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out the podcast notes. We are linking to a blog post with more on the life of Susanna Dickinson, who survived the Battle of the Alamo, to share the news of what happened. We're also linking to a blog post with more on the Battle of Refugio if you'd like to take a deeper dive. And remember, you still have time to see the Travis letter in person right here at the Alamo, on display through March 24th before it goes back to the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. You've been listening to Stories Bigger Than Texas, the Alamo Podcast.